welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this third and last session of this RSS special topic meeting on R, local R, and transmission. First, just a few housekeeping arrangements. The meeting is being recorded, and so if you don't want any of your details to be passed on, you need to contact Luz Martinez. Please keep your cameras off and microphone off during the presentation. Use the actual chat if you would like to ask questions at the end. So this meeting originated in lively discussion within the RSS COVID-19 task force about the statistical challenges of estimating local variation in the merge-quoted national level R number for the epidemic. We, Peter and Diggle, who is co-organizer with me, we decided to have a different format from the RSS discussion meeting, only in the way that we wanted to, we kind of shrink the timeline. And so we wanted a rapid response, a fast time frame, and we started mid-February. And I really want to thank all the authors and reviewers who have worked hard to make this possible. Apart from that, the format of the meeting follows the tradition of the RSS discussion meeting. So we're going to hear this afternoon 2 invited presentations, and the presenters will have 15 minutes each. And the first presentation will be given by Lorenzo Pellis on behalf of the JUNIPER group, and some other members of the team will speak during that presentation. And the second talk will be given by Maria Bekker-Nielsen Dunbar from Switzerland, and she will present all the joint work with Leonhard Held. Then we will have 2 invited discussants, and I will call first on Adam Kucharski from LHSTM, and secondly, Gianpaolo Scagliatomba from Rome. After that, we have 2 people who have expressed willingness to do some contributed discussion, and they will be given 5 minutes each. And I will call on Jasmina Pavlovska-Griffiths from the Oxford Big Data Institute and Steve Riley from Imperial. These are all the names I've got so far, but if some of you, and if time permits, if some of you want to ask additional questions, if time permits, just please use the chat and I might have time to call on you. At the end, I will give time to the presenters to answer the discussion and to make short comments. And of course, full answers will come later on after all the written contributions have been sent. I also wanted to say that if you don't participate orally today in the meeting, but you would like to send a contributed discussion later on, these are 400 words, and we accept contribution up to Monday, the 21st of June. Now, the proceedings of this meeting will be published electronically under the RSS banner. And also this meeting is being recorded, and the intention is to make this session available on YouTube, because clearly with the very busy timetable, not everybody is able to attend all these interesting meetings. Luz Martinez will monitor the chat with me. So without further ado, I would like to now invite Lorenzo Pellis to start his presentation and share his screen.
Okay, in reality, there are 4 of us speaking. 4
of you.
Yes.
Very good. So there's you, there's Lorenzo, Daniela, Paul Birrell, and
Lorenzo, Chris, Paul, and me. I'll just speak very, very quickly, give an introduction of 2 slides, and then Lorenzo will do the mathematical part.
Yes, I recall that it is, you have a 15-minute slot, sharing as you want.
It would be a great challenge. But anyway, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to present our work. And this is part of the work that we've been doing as a national response to the membership to SPIAM, which is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modeling. Is famous by now. We present on behalf of JUNIPER, which includes different academic and non-academic institutions, and the common thread is, we are linked through UKRI funding to work for the response, for epidemic response. And what we're presenting today is our experience of providing real time. And when we say real time, at the very beginning, for the first 3 months, it was 3 times a week. And then it became bi-weekly and then weekly estimates of these famous R numbers. And in fact, we produce estimates of other quantities as well over the last 15 months. This particular specific work that we're talking about today, and I hope we don't overrun, it comes from a really lively interaction between the two groups that work in JUNIPER, the mathematical modelers or mathematicians and the statisticians. We see things in different ways, and which is needed because sort of science is always multidisciplinary and different expertise is always essential. And this presentation reflects this kind of interaction. Next, please. So the outline is, we talk a little bit about the theory because we need to explain the theoretical concept we're talking about first. And Lorenzo will do this throughout, giving an example of different type of models. And then we have a session on the estimation of our reporting on our experience, particularly on mechanistic models, single type models and multi-type models. And then we'll have a discussion on, R, small r, big R, and so on and so forth. And we'll finish with our position. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. So first is Lorenzo, then is Chris, and then is Paul, and then is Lorenzo again. Please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny, with your introduction. We started discussing the theory because there are some conceptual challenges in the definition of these numbers, and we believe it's clearer if we really start with the proper mathematical definition. So we'll first discuss single-type models and then go increasing complexity step by step. Lots of this is book text material, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But if you write the ODEs for the standard SIR model, where S is susceptible to ion effectives and beta is transmission rate and gamma the recovery rate, you can calculate the growth rate at the beginning of the epidemic when you assume that everybody is susceptible by simply linearizing the system, at which point you have a linear solution of which little r0 is the epidemic growth rate. So you linearize the ODs around the disease-free steady state, you obtain exponential solutions. If you want to talk about reproduction numbers, you have to look at the epidemic in generations. Now you obtain a discrete system, you linearize that, and you obtain geometric growth as a solution, and R0 is the per generation multiplicative factor. So some considerations is that little r, the growth rate existed well before R0, really, as a concept. And but the reason why R0 has also becoming valuable is because it tends to have more explicit formula, which is useful when I have more complex models. But the important thing is that both concepts really provide equivalent threshold conditions, and they both require an exponentially growing window, so a period where the solution is actually growing exponentially in order to be well defined and drive the system dynamics. And this is the result of a linear approximation. And that approximation fails when the susceptible get depleted over time in a significant manner. They are macro parameters that summarize the qualitative behavior of the system in terms of the more basic parameters. And so they're really valuable concepts to kind of wrap up the qualitative behavior of the system and tells you whether epidemic will occur or not. In particular, R0 has other beautiful properties, like it tells you something about the final size, the critical immunity threshold. But these quantities, these properties are rapidly lost as the complexity of the system increases, the model complexity changes. And but it's still, in the end, it still provides a threshold condition, and it tells something relatively valuable, which is the fraction of effective transmission that needs to be blocked in order to stop numbers from growing. There is also the concept of the effective reproduction number that everybody is aware of. This is time varying because the fraction of susceptibles varies. It's often been called RT during this pandemic. We don't know exactly when it started calling RT rather than RE, but it's still the result of a linearization. The idea is that now we provide that linearization at a single point in time. So we shrink that window of exponential growth to a single point in time, very much in line with looking at the derivative of a function in a particular point. So it's a linear approximation of the function in that point. But in order for it to be visible and drive the system dynamics, we need to have at least a window of a meaningful length where the parameters and S can be considered approximately constant. Equivalently, we can have the effective growth rate. And the usefulness, if it provides real-time situational awareness, and it still tells the fraction of the effective transmission that needs to be blocking, as Gavin Gibson was saying today, and if measured before and after intervention, can measure the impact of that intervention. So the problem is that in real life, models are more complex. In particular, parameters vary over time. And this was the case when we entered into a lockdown. And even if the population was still basically fully susceptible, numbers started coming down because we changed the contact patterns in the population. So there is another number called the control reproduction number that we thought would be very valuable to introduce. Other people have used it before, but we think it needs more prominence. So it's the average number of infections made by a typical infective under the current contact patterns in a fully susceptible population. So if in this sketch, susceptibles are going down, infectives come up, then you introduce a lockdown, numbers are coming down, then you release the lockdown and numbers come up again. So R naught is constant. The control reproduction number drops below 1 because you change the contact patterns in the population, and drops above 1 again when you release your control and the epidemic starts again. And the effective reproduction number is similar to the control reproduction number, but takes into account this cradle depletion of susceptibles. So the property of the control reproduction number is that it ignores immunity, so it's often been called RE without immunity, and it equals R naught when the contact patterns are the natural contact patterns in the population. However, this concept allows comparing similar control policies at different times in the epidemic when there are different levels of immunity, for example, the March 2020 lockdown and the January 2021 lockdown. And it's not a concept that exists per each control policy. There's no RC for school closure or RC for lockdown, but it measures the overall impact of different control policies. And the reason why it's also valuable is because you might argue that here, with this level of contact patterns, we are below the critical vaccination threshold, but the real concept, the meaningful concept of critical vaccination threshold really refers to the natural contact patterns in the population. So saying that here we are below the critical vaccination threshold is a bit misleading. When you have models with multiple types, then you have some serious complications coming in. For example, different age classes are epidemiologically different. Then the linearized system of ODEs has matrix exponential solutions. In generations, you have a next generation matrix approach, and big R and little r are defined as nominal eigenvalues of this matrix. You can still define an exponentially growing phase, but you need to an exponentially growing window, but you need to wait until you reach until you pass over a transient phase determined by the initial conditions, during which numbers not necessarily grow exponentially. For example, in this case, you have two types. Type 1 is type 1, you start only with type 1, but type 2 is what really drives the epidemic. So you have to wait until all this transient phase has passed before actually seeing numbers growing exponentially, once the proportions of numbers of each type has stabilized on the dominant eigenvector. And when we talk about age classes or maybe settings and subpopulations, then the coupling between subpopulations and different types can be strong enough that the convergence to the eigenvector is rapid. But if you change control policies all the time, there is a risk that you just hop from one transient phase to another transient phase without ever settling on the proper exponentially growing window. In particular, when you use geographical models that capture geographical distinction, the coupling between different geographical regions may be too weak for the convergence to the dominant eigenvector to occur before you actually start experiencing the depletion of susceptibles. And this means that the exponentially growing windows has actually shrank up to disappearing. And an extreme manifestation of this is when you look at desynchronized epidemic in different locations where an epidemic turns around before you actually start an epidemic in another region. Without further ado, I'll move to estimation problems. So there is a lot of discussion about mechanistic and non-mechanistic models, but I'll skip these because we've seen many other talks that talk about this kind of convolution with the generation time distribution. And instead, we'll discuss about mechanistic models first. So Chris, over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Lorenzo. Yeah, so this is the model that we've developed in Manchester in collaboration with people at Oxford and Lancaster. And so it's a bit different to the models that we saw this morning, and partly this is driven because the we designed this model to generate short-term forecasts for hospital occupancy. So what we did with the model is we looked at what happens to COVID patients in hospital. We looked at the different compartments that they could be in the hospital and how long they spend in each of these compartments, which is the bit that Lorenzo was highlighting. And so we worked out how long patients spend in each compartment, which are these sort of R terms on the arrows, and we model these as transition rates. So there'll be ordinary differential equations taking someone, for example, that top box is hospital conditional on the fact that someone's going to end up dying. And then the RHD term is the rate at which they leave that compartment and enter the death compartment D. Similarly, we've got hospital conditional critical care, hospital conditional on recovery, and then subcompartments for critical care, depending on the different outcomes. And so we took a lot of care parameterizing this really well to all the high quality hospital data that we had. And then to generate short-term forecasts from this model, we coupled this hospital part up in the top right-hand corner with a background SEIR type epidemic, which is in the bottom left. And so in this model, it's a compartmental ODE epidemic model, or ordinary differential equations. So people start in susceptible and slowly flow through all those compartments. A subset of patients go into hospital, most of them go on to recovery. Next slide, please. So the key assumptions of this model are that it's a single type. We don't consider any age structure in the model at the moment, and it's only fitted to hospital data. So we have good data on all of those compartments that were in the top right-hand corner of the model. And we made this choice because at the start of the epidemic, there was really good data there, but less good data on cases and infections. We then assume that the transmission rate is piecewise constant, and we decide when we want to put these transmission rate changes in. So basically, whenever there's a large intervention, we assume that transmission rate changes on that day. And then we also regularly investigate the data to see whether there's any sort of changes in the log scale gradient. So if we look at this figure here, we've added these vertical lines represent when transmission changes. So we first have, we've got one changes before the first lockdown due to small interventions. We then have a change point when the first lockdown comes in, and we have a final change point, which is 3 weeks before the final data point to capture any recent trends in the data. And so we can then fit the model to the hospital system, and from this we can calculate the reproduction number. And so you can see that's very piecewise constant here, but there is some decay over time as the number of susceptibles in the population diminishes. But we can't really see that on the resolution of this graph because it was such early days that the rate at which susceptibles got depleted was very low. And one thing to notice here is the last sort of 10 days of estimates should be considered unreliable because we're only fitting this model to hospital data. And so if there's been a turning point in the epidemic curve in the last 10 days, that won't be reflected in hospital admissions yet. So although we're saying that we think R is around this, it's conditional on it not changing in that last 10-day window. So when we provide these estimates to SPI-M, we remove the last 10 days and truncate R estimates there. And we also fit independently to each region, yeah. So the consequences of these choices are that the model is pretty agile and it's maximally informed by the data. So we have all those very good data streams on hospital admission and hospital occupancy. The RE is well defined from a theoretical viewpoint, and it's easy to interpret. However, as the point there says, it's weakly constrained by the last 10 days of data, and also it struggles a little bit if the age mix in the case is changing. So, for example, if there's cases growing in the younger age group and declining in the older age group, it will take longer for that to be reflected in hospital admissions. So the model has to wait for the system to converge to that dominant eigenvector before it will reflect what's actually happening in the community. And then there's also choices as to whether we can also then estimate the growth rate little r, and we can either estimate this from the model definition, taking beta minus gamma, or we can estimate it from the gradual growth of the imputed infection curve from the model.
Okay, so I'd like to take over discussing the issues surrounding calculation of reproduction numbers in an age stratified or multi-type model. First, I'd like to do that, illustrate using the PHE, what's called the PHE Cambridge model for.
Paul, just to say you have a couple of minutes now.
Sure. Okay. In this model, we divide the country up into spatially disjoint, non-interacting epidemics to account for this weak coupling that Lorenzo was talking about. Whereas So we fit transmission models within each region. They're stratified by age within each region, which is the stronger coupling that Lorenzo also mentioned. But we then fit these models separately with shared parameters across the regions. In the blue area, the model is formed by these are susceptible states stratified by vaccination status. And we have seroprevalence data, which informs the fraction of the population that are in that state. In the shaded grey area, we've adapted an SEIR model to have an extra recently recovered state whereby people can be thought to be still PCR positive. This grey area links to prevalence data. And we also have, as the main driver for our model, data on deaths. So I've talked about most assumptions already. I want to quickly say that the dynamics of the model are deterministic in terms of the solution of the differential equation governing the dynamics. We augment our data with data on Google mobility, data from the time use survey, and from the DFE on school attendances. And these help us form contact matrices, which describe the rate at which different age groups interact. They're parameterized, and they're then the basis for the next generation matrices that Lorenzo introduced earlier. Our model structure is relatively simple compared to lots of the models that contribute to SPIM. We have lots and lots of time dependence introduced through piecewise linear and piecewise constant parameterizations. And as mentioned before, the calculation of reproduction numbers, effective or R0, are both derived from dominant eigenvalues of next generation matrices. And spit out of context the formula I've got there for the transmission probability. But it's dependent on C, which comes from the contact matrices. R0 star, which effectively is a normalizing constant of the initial contact matrices. R0, which is the reproduction number, and a time varying beta, which varies weekly, much to Guy Nason's disappointment. And that allows us to have, with a random walk prior on that allows this quantity to have introduce some stochasticity into the epidemic dynamics. So just to have a quick look at some of the kind of results that we publish working on the MRC Biostatistics Unit website. On the left is a plot of RT over time. Usually the big drops, such as around Christmas and in early January, and again in May when it starts increasing. These are in RT. These are due to the school holidays or due to various lockdown or relaxation of lockdown measures. So we curtail our random walk prior about 3 weeks prior to the current date and use the contact matrices or the continuation of contact matrices, which is a more current data set. It informs transmission that's occurring currently, to now cast our estimates up to the current date and beyond. If you look very closely on the right-hand plot, since those for keen eyes, it's sections that would correspond to flat parts of the RT. We have a within-week variation. We have about 2 days where there's a transition between the different eigenvector, eigenvalue regimes that Lorenzo mentioned, where over which period the empirical and the theoretical growth rates would not coincide. Or there'll be some discrepancy between the two. Another strange quirk of the way we do the modelling is that the national RE is a weighted average of the individual regional estimates. Because it's based on Monte Carlo summaries. Typically, on one set of parameters, the weighted average will be close to the largest value for RE. When taken over a bunch of Monte Carlo summaries where the different regions might contribute the largest value of RE, it's actually possible for the national average, based on the posterior mean or median, to be larger than the individual ones.
Can you please
this is a discussion just to wrap up?
Yeah, can you please move towards the conclusion? I don't know who does. Yes, thank you.
Yes, so there are a lot of comparison between reproduction number and growth rate that have been discussed before. So we'll leave these all to the discussion. But basically, both of them are lagged because all the data streams are lagged. And on top of it, the reproduction number has an additional layer of model that models the transmission part of it. So it requires additional assumptions, and it's more delayed and more sluggish because it has the same delay as a little r plus some extra convolution. And also implicitly means that all of the growth you're seeing, you're attributing that to transmission. So for example, it's a problem when you have a lot of importations, in which case the growth is also determined by importation, not only by transmission. But the problems of R naught and little r were very problematic at the beginning, in particular, but most of these are discussed in this paper, so I'm not going to, I'll leave them for a discussion later on, and instead we'll move to our position. So both of them provide slightly different pieces of information, so it's worth keeping them both. But in the moment, in the pandemic, a big R has only been used really to describe whether the epidemic is growing or declining, and so you might as well just use little r to determine that because it's more immediately available and less delayed. They are both averages, so all the problems about aggregating across geographies and subpopulations are the same for both parameters, so it's not that one is better than the other in that sense. Communication is a big problem. Big R is easy to interpret from a layman, but risks over-prominence because of this easier communication. Little r is a rate, so it's more difficult to communicate, but doubling times are an alternative, easier way of communicating R, but only when the epidemic is fully growing or fully declining. Otherwise, if you cross the threshold, then the doubling time goes to infinity. And more indicators are needed. These big R and little r are measures of change, a bit like a derivative. So you need information about current state of the system, and the current state of the system is determined by many indicators, hospitalizations, ICU bed, and case prevalence. And I'm finished with this. So we don't believe the concept should be buried at all, but we agree that there is a bit too much emphasis on it. We were really happy at the beginning to have conveyed this concept to policymakers, but then we tried to expand and introduce caveats, and that's been more difficult. So communication is difficult because caveats are never really read as carefully as results. But lots of people have worked relentlessly on providing this real-time assessment and have thought a lot about these concepts. What we need is more work to educate policymakers and the public, and any welcome to improved communication is very, very appreciated, like this conference, for example. Thanks to the consortium, and thank to you all.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, Daniela, Chris, and Paul, for this very insightful presentation. Lots of experience, lots of knowledge compacted in 20 minutes. Let's look forward to the discussion. I think some of the points you make have been echoed, by other speakers. I mean, I think there's a really nice consensus growing here. Can I call now on Maria? Maria, to share. So can you stop sharing your thing and your screen, and then Maria, are you okay sharing your screen?
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
So Maria and Leo, you have the floor.
So I'm going to present work from our project, which is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. It's called SUSPend, and we're going to showcase work where we've looked at the effect of school closures on COVID-19 cases during the first wave in Zurich. So we want to determine the usefulness of school closures, but we need to consider that additional cases are not equal, in the sense that if we see additional cases among children, this might be fine because we didn't see a lot of severe disease outcomes in COVID-19 among children in the first wave, but additional cases in elderly populations might be of concern because they might have severe disease outcomes. And so we need to incorporate the interdependencies between age groups in order to address this question. So to look at this, we fit an endemic epidemic model to the daily COVID-19 cases given by the age groups below. And the endemic epidemic modeling framework is a multivariate time series model framework for aggregated surveillance data, which was developed by Leo and various colleagues over the past 15 years. And it's a very flexible modeling framework. It's been used in applications to myriad infectious diseases, and increasingly has been used to model COVID-19. And to link it to things that people in the meeting might be more familiar with, it can be motivated from a discrete time compartment or SIR model. So once we've fit a model to our case counts, we then conduct a counterfactual analysis where we predict the expected number of cases we would see if schools were closed and if schools were open, because no natural experiment occurred where some schools were open and some were closed. So that's our motivation for doing a counterfactual analysis. So I mentioned the interdependencies between age groups, and contact matrices were mentioned just before. So a contact matrix gives us the number of contacts a person in an age group has with other age groups. And these contacts are setting specific, and then you combine them with weights. And we use weights for respiratory diseases given with the synthetic contact matrices we use, which are shown on the right here. So if we just combine them as they are with the weights, we obtain a total contact matrix, but that's contacts outside of the pandemic situation. And as many people in this meeting will have experienced, last year there were levels of disease control measures put in place to curb contacts, because contacts can be considered a proxy for transmission. And so we created policy indicators following the same groupings that the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker used. And then we apply them to these contact matrices. So what you see on the left is the reduction in contacts on different days for different policy indicators. So we said that requirements to stay at home would likely affect contacts in household settings. Requirements to work from home would affect contacts in work settings. Restrictions on gatherings would affect contact in other settings, and school closure will affect contacts in schools. Now, schools opened during the first wave in Switzerland. You can see this on the left, but we do also have school holidays. So we also need to reduce contacts on days where schools are open, but there aren't any contacts in school anyway because the children aren't there. So once we've done this, we have these time-varying transmission weights. And for the benefit of those who weren't in Zurich last year, this seems realistic because we went into lockdown about a week before the UK, so the 17th of March, and measures were relaxed going into summer. So we look at these, this is just a snapshot. We have one for every time point. And they seem realistic to us. So now we have transmission weights to enter into our endemic-epidemic model. The endemic-epidemic model considers cases given the past and assumes they follow a negative binomial distribution where the mean is decomposed additively into endemic and epidemic components, where the endemic component is new cases by external factors that are independent of the history of the epidemic process, and the epidemic component is a higher order autoregressive process driven by cases in other age groups as well as cases on previous days. And here we see two of the extensions Leo has made with Sebastian Meyer to incorporate contact matrices and age structure, and with Johannes Bracher to include higher order lags. And this model is readily available in the R packages surveillance and HHH4 add-on, and the code we've used to conduct our analysis is available from the webpage listed in the top right of the slides. So the transmission weights you saw from the previous slide enter into the epidemic component, and we also have a discrete time serial interval distribution. And this we used a shifted Poisson representation because this meant that the mode didn't have to be at lag 1. And kappa is an unknown parameter which is estimated from the data. And then we included the following 4 effects in what we call our baseline model. We always included age because this is vital to our analysis. We considered that transmission opportunities may be lower on public holidays, but that affects the entire population, so this enters as a model covariate rather than part of the time-varying transmission weights. And we thought cases may fluctuate systematically across day of the week. And finally, we thought there could be temporal changes in under-ascertainment rates if there was something like an increase in testing capacity during the study period, so we also incorporated this. And in addition to this, we included in either the endemic or epidemic component an effect of temperature, a linear time trend, and a non-linear time trend, and selected the best model based on Bayesian information criterion. The final model we have has the 4 effects that we have in the baseline model, and additionally we have a smooth non-linear trend in both the endemic and epidemic component, and we also have a linear time trend in the epidemic component, and the final model has 40 parameters. Here are our model coefficients. We see a day of the week effect, and it doesn't seem to be the same for the 2 components. We see a less pronounced effect of the testing rate in the endemic component, and the nonlinear time trend, which in the model is given by sine cosine waves, we express these as amplitude and phase, and we see that the nonlinear time trend is in particular in the epidemic compartment because we have a much larger amplitude. Finally, we see different patterns of age in the endemic and epidemic components, and there seems to be more variation in the epidemic component. The model seems to capture the patterns we see in our data well. And as you see, there's a low number of cases in the youngest age group. Now we have our endemic epidemic model, and now we wish to look at the effect of school closure. So as we mentioned, all the schools were closed, so we weren't able to use data arising from natural experiments. So instead, we use this counterfactual approach where we predict the course of the epidemic under 2 scenarios, what we call scenario A, where the schools are closed, and what we call scenario B, where the schools are open. And in scenario B, schools close on school holidays, but otherwise are open. And then we predict the path forecast under these 2 scenarios from the day after state of emergency was declared for Switzerland, so after lockdown. And then we wish to look at the expected number of COVID-19 cases under these 2 scenarios. So we incorporate 2 types of uncertainty, which we've denoted external and internal. The external uncertainty are the weights used to combine the contacts across settings to obtain the total contact matrix. And here we assumed a normal distribution, and we also incorporate what we call internal uncertainty, which are our model coefficient estimates. So we showed you some of them, not all 40, but we simulated from a 40-dimensional multivariate normal distribution. And we simulated these 2 types of uncertainty 1,000 times, and then calculated the values shown on the screen based on the corresponding samples. And the distributions are skewed, which is why we present them with percentiles. But we would like to highlight a couple of things we found as a result of our approach. So as could be expected, there's a larger increase in cases relatively among the youngest age group, and this makes sense because they have more transmission opportunities as they have more contact opportunities in the alternative scenario where schools are open. But we see that in terms of the median relative increase, it decreases from 21% down to 1% as we increase in age. So the increase among the oldest age group is the smallest of all the age groups we have here. And the absolute increase also is small. Then we've looked at the increase over time, and we show here the relative increase rather than the absolute increase. We see the youngest age group, which is the blue curve, 0 to 14-year-olds, their cases increase. But we can also see the school holidays here, which are the dips in the curve where the schools are closed under both scenarios. Then we have the green curve, which experiences the second increase in cases temporarily. And the green curve is the age group, which are the parents of those in the light blue curve. So we call this a parent effect. And then we see that changes to one age group because of the interdependencies affect other parts of the population as we expected, but we see that the contact matrices translate in a temporal dynamic also. So we found that this was a useful approach to looking at an intervention for a specific part of the population. And we were able to use these time-varying transmission weights to account for the interdependencies between the age groups. And we captured the statistical uncertainty in this work. And so we're able to provide a table like the one you saw, which have expected number of cases over the whole study period, but we're also able to look at things from a temporal dimension. In terms of limitation, we have assumed that the model parameters are the same under both scenarios, and that might not be the case. And we've also assumed that in our surveillance system, there's no underreporting. And this is slightly unrealistic for the first COVID-19 wave. We know asymptomatic cases were occurring, but in our SUSPend project, we're looking into ways of incorporating underreporting, which takes into account both time and age. Additionally, we want to extend the work we've done here for Zurich to look at similar questions at country level, where the levels of school closure may be different, and so we need to weight things at federal level. And one thing we wish to mention is that the approach we've used here can also be applied to spatial temporal spread. So we've looked at the effect of border closure between Switzerland and neighboring regions in Italy and conducted a counterfactual analysis looking at what would the difference in expected cases be if the border wasn't closed at all, and what would the expected number of cases be if the border was closed 2 weeks earlier. And here's our acknowledgement slide.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the very clear presentation. Actually, this morning in one of the discussions, Bekker-Nielsen was alluding to the use of time series model.
Hi, Sylvia, can you hear us?
Has Sylvia disappeared momentarily?
It's Peter Diggle. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we have two invited discussants lined up, and I have to confess, not expecting to chair. I'm not sure which of the two is first up. Adam and Jampi, who's going first?
Adam was taught to be
okay,
first.
Adam, you're on.
Okay.
Yeah. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to the teams for those presentations and the accompanying papers. I think it's clear that understanding the extent of disease transmission and how it changes over time is a deceptively difficult problem. And these papers really highlight a lot of the considerations in how we should estimate and interpret COVID transmission dynamics. So Lorenzo and colleagues really nicely outlined the conceptual choices that must be made when we estimate reproduction numbers. Even if we were to be omniscient and could see every contact and every transmission event, we would still have to make conceptual decisions about those estimations. For example, whether we look back at transmission that's already occurred or whether we try and predict ongoing transmission from current infectious individuals, which is obviously subject to right censoring. We'd also have to average across these events, so implicitly giving a weighting to the sub-outbreaks that make up our wider epidemic. And as the presenters noted, in reality, we have the further challenge of partial observation. So as illustrated in recent contact tracing studies, you typically see a much lower R than the observed epidemic trajectory implies. And in turn, there's often discrepancies between the observed case numbers and the likely underlying epidemic patterns. Then there's also the question of how our estimates are used. Are they designed to track the current epidemic, to predict its near future trajectory, or to evaluate historical changes in transmission? And in practice, a model might be used to do all of these things, but the same tool won't necessarily be optimal for all of these applications. And both of the papers accompanying presentations note that the transmission process implicit in our estimation can make it slower to respond to sudden changes in transmission. So R has a clear epidemiological interpretation, which can help in understanding control impact, especially if we can separate the effects of immunity from other factors reducing R, as Lorenzo and co did with their RC breakdown. But this reliance on an inherent transmission assumption can lead to challenges in interpretation, particularly in these rapidly changing epidemics that take several generations of infection to settle down to equilibrium. So the example of schools is highlighted in both the papers, that opening and closing schools may in the short term lead to some transient effects that don't reflect the underlying transmission we'd see after convergence to that dominant eigenvector, especially if the epidemic's growing from low levels. And there's analogies here with other pathogens. For example, flu pre-COVID, you'd see new strains imported by older groups traveling internationally, and then you'd get local spread in wider segments of the population, creating these kind of transient eigenvector issues. And in the analysis resource of school closures presented by Maria and colleagues, it was really focusing on use of case time series directly rather than these transformed R estimates. And this has the advantage of reducing the smoothing incurred during R estimation. But there's also a challenge here in terms of interpreting coefficients, particularly if case reporting varies over time. Should we interpret rapidly varying case numbers as the result of sudden changes in transmission or variability in how cases are being reported? And although we can use wider data to characterize the observation transmission process to some extent, and this is something that I think is typically understudied compared to transmission modeling itself, the lack of a ground truth for R or the force of infection means that we inevitably have to rely on our choices about this transmission and observation model. And in turn, we have this issue of interpretability versus predictive power. If our aim is to make mechanistic predictions comparing hypothetical control options, then we do need to understand how these different components of transmission are changing. But if our aim is simply to make reliable predictions about the impacts of past interventions from the data we have, we may be more willing to do so at the expense of interpretability. The two papers and the presentations nicely emphasize the challenge of communicating both statistical and conceptual uncertainty. So to give an example that was quoted by Lorenzo and colleagues in their paper, if you had an estimate of a 51% probability that R is above 1, is that sufficient to make a policy decision? And the authors of the papers suggest many additional metrics, things like infection prevalence, hospital occupancy, growth rate, super spreading events, predicted cases, all as ways that can provide further context around these single metrics. But as we've seen with the rise of the Delta variant in the UK in May 2021, the potentially most valuable information in real time is often the most recent and hence the least certain. And on top of this, we have this combination of, at the moment, heterogeneous immunity, changing contact patterns, variation in subpopulations of spread. And for variants, that can limit the extent to which early data allows an estimation of a pure biological transmission advantage, so a kind of R0, rather than just a simple growth advantage, so little r, or a multiplicative increase in RE in the areas where variants are spreading. I think these decisions around how to combine metrics are likely to become harder as COVID vaccination further decouples the relationships between available data sets. You know, ultimately, this is a good problem to have, with social contacts no longer leading to hospitalizations and deaths, but it will create further challenges for generalizability. The presentations we've seen are focused on the UK and Switzerland respectively, but the spread of variants of vaccines globally will increasingly create a need for tailored local analysis of transmission, whether we're talking about tracking the current spread or evaluating subsequent interventions. So I'd like to thank the presenters again for some very interesting discussion and analysis.
Thank you, Adam. Sylvia, are you with us? I suspect Sylvia's having trouble with her network again, but Jean-Pi, you have the floor for up to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Let me share some slides I've prepared quickly. Let's see if this works. Yes, it looks like. You can see the slides?
Yep.
So my first comment is a kind of excuse that, as you see, being among the last discussions is good because I've already heard many good things, but it decreases my possibility to say new things. So excuse me if I repeat some things that have already been said. I would like to thank both the presenters for their papers and the RSS for having organized this interesting meeting about R. And let's go to the core of things. My first impression about the two papers, what they were about the same thing, but in opposite order. One is concentrated on time series analysis with a mechanistic component. The other one is mostly interested in the mechanistic component, but there is a time series component in the sense that it needs statistical estimation all the time to fill in these mechanistic components. So what it shows is that you need both parts in the reality modeling or reality inference. It's very difficult to compare the papers because they treat different things. One is about counterfactual inference, and the other one is more of a review and discussion of a lot of modeling and statistical related work, with emphasis, of course, on Great Britain and United Kingdom. Anyway, some comments that are related to the papers. The introduction of RC was interesting because we only had 2 R's and now we have 3, and there are more perhaps that can be defined. But when talking about the effect of interventions as such, isolated from possible immunity or increasing immunity or decreasing susceptibility, is it something that can meaningfully be estimated? Yes, but compared with other things, I mean, do interventions have an effect as such, or does it depend on the order, the combination, the state of the disease when it happens, or what the public sentiment is at the moment they are implemented? So is it really useful to attribute something to interventions as such? Or do you have to consider all of this to give an estimate of possible effects? However, although I see these complications, which are similar to, I don't know, statistical estimation of treatment effects of successive interventions and things like that, the idea of concentrating a little bit on the effect of certain interventions will be used because there will certainly be more and more discussion about the worth and cost, the cost-benefit balance of different interventions, especially when things have calmed down a little bit, a state that I hope we are approaching in some sense, at least for some time. Another thing about the different R values, many of us, both listening and talking, are people doing theory of models. And we are very conscious about all the different R values that have been proposed in different models and their dependence on model structure and whatever. But if the accepted meaning we want to carry across is average number of secondary cases at a certain time, why not try to estimate this out of all models? Because it can be estimated in most models, since we have incidence, prevalence, and population proportions and whatever in most models. We could estimate the average number of secondary cases, even if it's not the threshold quantity, that we would have a comparable quantity between models. That's just a kind of proposal that's probably not very useful, but it's interesting. If we instead go to the Swiss paper, the Bekker-Nielsen Dunbar and Held paper, they instead contain a very useful ingredient, namely how to study and use changes in the contact pattern of the population over time. And they do that by starting with a synthetic age group structured matrix, and then they modify it according to the counterfactual study they want to make. But looking at this age group stratified contact matrix, which is a common feature to many, many models that we have used recently. And it might also not only be age groups, but maybe other population groups or whatever. The question is something that I've never found a really good answer to. To what level can you aggregate or disaggregate contact matrices in a model and still get kind of a coherent result? Because aggregating or disaggregating corresponds to summing multi-type processes. And we know in theory that summing a multi-type process does not give you in a simple or direct way a single group model. And so how do you choose the level of aggregation when you use contact matrices? Is an interesting question as such, maybe theoretical, but anyway, interesting. Some common points, I think, or maybe general points, because they don't necessarily refer to these two specific papers, although there are components and discussion about these things. Most of the things that we have been talking about, for instance, the fact that R is difficult to estimate because there is a delay in whatever observable you use for the estimation. And these delays are probably varying over time, both the administrative delays and delays depending on which are the high prevalence groups of the moment. And that's even more important for the not reporting, or if you prefer to call it underreporting of cases, which will depend a lot on which groups the epidemic is prevalent in at the moment because of different symptom frequencies or whatever. Why? I haven't seen much work on trying to model the time courses of these quantities as such and inputting them in the models, rather than just saying that data are not informative about the last 2 or 3 weeks or something. There was a lot of this work done for the HIV epidemic, trying to correct for all the possible delays, but the delays were longer and maybe more stable, but still. And the generation time distribution, which is another important component, especially if you try to estimate R using a kind of a non-model dependent method. We probably know that generation times are varying all over the epidemic. They vary when, they might vary as such in different dynamic regimes, but they certainly will have varied when we did interventions of various kinds, shortening infectious periods or doing various things to them. How can you integrate that in the estimation of RT? Because every time the formula is presented for RT, you can see fixed weights, essentially, that are used, which means that in some way we have assumed a fixed generation time distribution. while in reality it should be time dependent, and how could that be modeled? And then there is a kind of personal doubt of mine, I don't know how many will share it, namely, why do we use mass action? Because mass action is kind of nice, and when it was introduced, it was thought of as the contacts in a rather small group of people, a school maybe, or a school class or something like that. But there is no real theory that tells us that we can aggregate this to larger populations. So there's certainly something wrong when we use mass action like contacts between people for large populations. And usually it is argued that, well, they work fine because we can adapt them rather well to disease data. So we can fit these models that usually have several parameters to outbreak curves or something like that. But in order to say something ahead or to do counterfactual experiments with interventions, we also need to know that they have the correct mechanics in them. So how much support do we have for the basics of many of our models? Not all of them by all means, but many of our models that use mass action-like dynamics. And final comment, I will succeed in calling in Einstein in this, which is always a good thing, I hope. When listening to the discussion, the previous discussions in these meetings and other meetings, most of us modelers, statisticians, I call it us because I think it is a kind of community, agree that just presenting 1 hour or 2 hours or something like that is too little to really describe an epidemic. And it's also too little to propose really topical interventions that would be maximally efficient, etc. And we also usually understand model components and limitations and the dynamics of the models. But then this has got lost when communicating outside, both to politicians and the general public. And in one of the recent comments was that we have tried to tell politicians to kind of consider more things, but it's difficult. But also listening to, I don't know how many TV debates here in Italy, in the end, the most experts both among us and others tend to say, well, the important thing is to calculate R. If R is above 1, then we must act, etc., etc. So there's something about trying to simplify things when they are communicated to others than us, which are the experts, which the question is, how much should that be done? I see a kind of political value in just using R. It's kind of so simple that everybody should understand it, but at the same time, if you simplify too much, it becomes almost false. And the question is, to what point should one try to communicate all the relevant facts, or most of the relevant facts, although that leads to a complex view of things, less certain maybe. And that's when I finally found some resonance with something that Einstein is supposed to have said, namely that models should be as simple as possible, but not more. And maybe that should have applied to the information about epidemic and epidemic models that we as a community have also sent out to the exterior. That was that.
Thank you very much, Gianpaolo. I apologize for my network connection, and this co-chairing with Peter works really well.
Yes, yes.
So I missed. Very good thought to finish. I think the communication aspect in the model complexity is a real challenging issue, and I think as a community, and I hope this meeting, has brought that to the fore. Besides all the technical aspects that we understand as a community, the public communication is very important, and at what level and so on. I think that's a challenging topic, and of which the community has to think together on that. I can see Danny nodding. So now, so thank you very much for the two invited discussants. I think now it's time to invite contribution from the floor, and there's two people who had registered their wish. So I'll call first on Jasmina Pavlovska-Griffiths, who from the Oxford Big Data Institute, to make some remarks. Jasmina, the floor is yours. You are muted.
Very nice presentation by both presenters, and thank you, Adam and Jampi, for a wonderful discussion as well. I think there are 3 points I'd like to raise in the short amount of time that I'm going to talk. That is around what do we know about big R and little r, so reproduction number and R, and how do we know that they are connected? So everyone mentioned on that already during their talks and discussions. And then once we think about what they mean both within models and between models, how do we combine them in order to make a general official statistics? And then the third point is that are we still thinking, and we're still certain that this is really still the key official statistics epidemics that we need to think about. So I'll just elaborate quickly on those 3 points. On the first point, as it was mentioned by Jampi, it's really important to think that while reproduction number and growth rate are very similar, and reproduction number is telling us about how many secondary infections will arise from an infection, and growth rate is telling us that we have a growing or expanding or contracting and declining epidemic. Within the modeling structure and the writing of the mathematical equation, there is differences in how they are defined, and that the differences are really within the distribution of the generation time or the time to infection. And that gives us mathematically or statistically speaking a sort of different probability density function. And once you have that as a different probability density function, then within the models, it is propagated differently depending on the different model structures. So just an example, so I work with agent-based models, for example, where you count the secondary infection. So you can really count R specifically at every time point. If I count this every day, and then I average as a rolling 7-day average per week, that's going to be one different value. If I, for example, do the same for 2 weeks and they track back in 1 week. So there are subtle differences that we need to think when we make reproduction number and when we make growth rate from the models, and then how those two differ. Then there is the question around how do you combine them? And as Lorenzo mentioned in his talk, there is methods that were developed for the purposes and are used within SPIAM of combining the different model outcomes. And these are sort of statistical methods where you either look at a sort of random effect or as opposed to fixed effect of combining models. And you really try to account that you're not biasing your outcome based on mechanistic or non-mechanistic models. Because, for example, if you have a model group that has a larger number of one type of models, be that population, growth, SEIR type models, or a sort of non-mechanistic renewal-based equation models, or an agent-based model, your statistically combined outcome that assumes that every outcome from the model is independent and often independent, and it's kind of there are assumptions there from the statistical point of combining those distributions that we need to think about. The last point is around interventions, and as it was mentioned, R is used. One of the reasons that R is widely used is because it really tells us responsive effect from interventions, such as was mentioned in Maria's talk, of schools closing and opening, again lockdowns being imposed and being left out. Vaccination is the other aspect I will mention, because it's really important to think what happens, first of all, to the pool of susceptible people which you are going to model and how you are then going to count the propagation of infection within that, and then on top of that calculate specifically reproduction number and R. And I think this is important. So I will finish by posing the question for discussion, whether we still think that reproduction number in any of the definitions that Lorenzo gave us is still and growth rate, are they both still the most useful epidemics to use, or are we also to consider other aspects such as it was mentioned, for example, hospitalization rate or ICU intensive care units admission rate, etc. So I will finish with just posing that question, and I think those three challenges that I mentioned are something that we need to think about.
Thank you very much, Jasmina. I will now call on Steve Riley, who are you around, Steve, to make some comments?
Thank you, yeah, and thank you to the presenters and to the previous discussants. It's only one thing worse than Gianpaolo going at the very end of the discussants after you've all made such good points is even worse. And actually, the two main points I'm going to make are related to two things that Gianpaolo said as well, by coincidence. Honestly, I've got my notes, I've kept my notes, so maybe. Thanks to the author groups for the papers themselves and for all the hard work, especially the SPIEM group. There's thousands and thousands of person hours have gone into that work over the year, and it is very much appreciated by everybody who has got to see those results. So not just the papers, but thank you for the work. And then, yeah, I would agree with Gianpaolo that as time goes forward, the assessment of interventions and the efficacy of interventions is going to continue to be a very important topic. This will, think back to how much work we did on the 1918 pandemic, those of us in flu, and that was nearly 100 years after it happened. There's, unfortunately or fortunately, we're going to have to examine and re-examine this for years to come. And we're going to want ways to really accurately understand how effective interventions were. Because when something like this happens in the future, we will want to be able to much more accurately titrate these types of things. We all know what the policy makers wanted. They wanted to say how much, they wanted a recipe, how many grams of NPIs did I need to put in to keep R just below 1? And we tried, and we are trying, but it's very difficult. So I think it's going to continue to be a really big issue. And so there's two methodological points that I'd like to make. And as I say, they link back to previous comments. So the first one I think that applies to both the papers to some degree is that I think that we need a better null hypothesis for our models of intervention, so that we can perhaps do more, we can present results more in the classic hypothesis test way than perhaps we do. So I think that we tend to condition on the time at which interventions occur, and we condition on the background transmissibility being constant in between change points. Not universally so, but that's a very standard formulation for fully mechanistic and some very impactful semi-mechanistic statistical models of interventions. And I think that's a very heavy, in some ways, that's quite a strong assumption and conditions on things happening at a specific time. So I think there is a need for flexible representations of changing rates of transmission that we can use as null hypotheses, and then say, okay, so if we know, for example, that school closures happen on days A, B, and C, and we can run that against a more kind of flexible model and do some parsimony tests, I think that's going to make our conclusion considerably stronger. And I think that's I think essentially that ties into kind of having a more neutral hypothesis, rather than we know for sure this thing works and it started at time T. Say, well, perhaps it worked and perhaps it didn't, and if it did, can we generate evidence for how much it works? So I think that's kind of one point. And then the second one, which is perhaps a little bit more esoteric, but in the first paper, Lorenzo, colleagues made a really good point that after the initial explosive exponential phase, that perhaps we could describe the epidemic as a series of non-stationary transitions between what might eventually become eigenvectors if we ever reach them. And Jasmine has just made some points to this as well. I think that, and Gianpaolo, that the secondary case rate must exist. So we can reformulate any compartmental model as a very crude, strange individual-based model in which waiting times are exponentially distributed, and we could read off secondary case distributions from the analogous individual-based model for any given compartmental model. And I think it would be really interesting to do that kind of comparison and kind of see, really, do we ever exit those transitional stages? Or, to some degree, are there large phases of the epidemic where R doesn't really exist? So, and I don't know, I've not looked in the list. I don't know if Jeff Eaton is here, but many years ago, we had long coffee discussions about HIV and the reproduction number and whether it really exists because of the generation time. I think, not to close on too esoteric a point, but I think the observation that we move from transitional phase to transitional phase in this compartmental framework might have profound impact for how effective interventions have to be at any point in time to really bring things under control. So thank you very much to the presenters and the discussants, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, all the presenter and contribution discussion. I think we have, I've seen, though I'm not have access to the chat, but I saw a couple of questions that I could call on if you did it very quickly in just the 1 minute to pose your question, because I do want to hand back the floor to the presenters. And I saw, Peter, you had asked a question, Peter Diggle, and I also saw John Dakpuna putting a question. So Peter, do you want to briefly say something very quickly?
Yeah, it's simply that it seems to me at various points in the discussion, the criticality of the number of susceptibles has been raised. And that does seem to me to be one of the hardest things to estimate at a local level. We do have national ballpark estimates, but I wonder if the speakers have any comment on that. Thank you.
And John, would you like to, so I didn't have time to read all your comment, but I noticed a long comment in the chat. Do you want to speak to that or just leave it as such? And otherwise, please unmute yourself.
I think Chris answered that very clearly for me. One's just interested in perhaps in the distribution of time between leaving an infectious stage and perhaps going into ICU and so forth. And there is a question of the delay time distribution and how this affects things on the upslope and on the downslope. One has to be careful not just to take the expectation, but I think basically Chris answered my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. So it's now my pleasure to hand back the floor to both the presenters. And for the first paper, I don't know who would like to make some comment. Lorenzo, Danny, Paul.
Can I start by replying to Peter immediately and then leave the other two speakers and then come back on some of the other points, but I don't want to speak for too long continuously. Peter, thank you very much for your question. As you can imagine, like estimating the fractional susceptibles in the population is one of the really most difficult challenges. I think Paul and Danny's, like the PHE and Cambridge model is more suited for that because they are fitting to other data streams as well, like the ONS data, some form of seroprevalence data. So they have some means of using data to constrain the out-of-hospital epidemic. In our case, we are fitting only to hospital data streams. And therefore, if we have an epidemic that infects twice as many people, or only half of them end up in hospital, we would fit the same data equally well. In that sense, it's partially addresses what Jampi raises a point, why trying to estimate RC when we can estimate RE and that is stop there. In reality, in this particular model was set up to use the data we had, especially at the beginning, and try to do short-term predictions for only a couple of weeks of what would have happened, especially with the hospitals. So it was doing a relatively simple task, if you want, which is to kind of fit the hospital data stream and then continue that trend. And in that respect, if we get the susceptible population wrong in that model, For example, if the susceptible population is twice as large, then the model would estimate a transmission rate which is half as big. And the two things compensate each other so that they actually fit the same data in the same way. And although the parameters are actually not perfect, not well identifiable, then the predictions of the model in terms of just continuing that data stream will still be relatively accurate. What I mean is that fitting the data stream and continuing them is a fairly benign task. Yeah. And so I agree with you that estimating a fraction of susceptible population is difficult, but for the initial task that model was created to do, it was also not necessarily that directly relevant. But it's a very good point, and there are better models suited for that.
Lorenzo, can I just come in on that? Because you mentioned that we use serological data to estimate, or what we use serological data from the blood donors. Thank you, Danny. We use serological data from blood donors to measure the acquisition of infection during the first wave. But as antibody response is wane over the course of the pandemic, and it seemed to wane rather rapidly compared to other infections, that data loses its interpretation quite rapidly. And in conversation with Nick Gent at PHE, who's a very senior consultant, to have an indication of who's susceptible and who's not, you actually need challenge studies to be able to because a loss of an antibody response in blood serum is not the same to a loss of immunity. And it's really a challenge study that will sort of mark out the level of susceptibility in the population. And of course, when you get a new variant, all that will change as well.
What about Chris? I think your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just to add on to what Lorenzo was saying.
We can't. You're very faint.
Oh,
Can you get
is that
close?
better? Yeah, so to add to what Lorenzo was saying, basically, although in theory to work out RE, you need to scale by the proportion of susceptibles. If you have these, say, two situations where you could have twice as many susceptibles, the RE value will effectively come out the same, because that's really constrained by the growth rate trends. So if your hospital admissions are growing at a certain rate, it doesn't matter what proportion of asymptomatics or symptomatics you assume, the RE estimates are effectively going to be very similar at that time. But what it could significantly affect would be the RC estimates. And similarly, your R0 estimates, because they're the unobserved thing. So although in theory RE needs the number of susceptibles, RE is what we're actually observing. And you then have to sort of deconstruct them to get the RC and the R0 estimates back out of it.
Daniela.
I just wanted to pick up on another topic. Jumpy talked about the reporting delay in the data, and what we used to do for HIV or AIDS was much easier. Here we're talking about data changing daily, and we're talking about data having and the reporting pattern changing daily, and not necessarily very easily predictable, because there have been lots of administrative hiccups. So that has been really challenging. We've done it for the deaths, and we've learned that it is not an easy task. So unfortunately, in the things that we had to run regularly, maybe 3 times a week, we had to exclude a few days of the data, for instance, in the deaths. We did use, we trying to put the reporting delay adjusted, but then you would have had to add an awful lot more uncertainty. So I'm not sure whether that was, we were not sure whether that would be worth considering. But I want to make another point. The adjustment for reporting delay in this case, okay, is important, but I think the most important thing is the biases in the data. In the biases which change in a very totally unpredictable and completely sort of, there is completely lack of understanding. For instance, one of the choices that we made was not to use the number of cases, because the number of cases would vary not only with the testing resources, the availability of testing, but also in response to all sort of little outbreak, where mobile units would be brought in or out, and the pattern was absolutely horrendous. We spent 3 weeks back in September to try to make sense and make a statistical adjustment, if you like, but that was not possible. and it still remains really a difficult task, which I think some people some colleagues from ATI have started to look at. So rather than reporting delay, actually the observational bias change over time in a completely unpredictable way. I think was the worst problem is actually the worst.
Thank you, Danny. Yes, I can echo that and about the bias and the fact that thanks to having the ONS survey and the REACT survey, we can get a handle on that bias, and we are one of the only country which has these regular surveys on really a national scale. So we are fortunate in that respect to be able at least to get a handle on that bias, but it's not easy. And indeed, there's been some recent work from the RSS Turing Lab on that. Now, can I call on Leo and possibly Maria to come back on concerning their paper and their thoughts on all the questions, really. Leo?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So thank you. So first, I want to really thank you, Sylvia and Peter, for organizing this meeting, and then also the Royal Statistical Society. I thought back a little in time, and more than 20 years ago, I started to do infectious disease modeling with you, Sylvia, actually.
Yes.
And at the time, I was really surprised that this field was a side topic in statistics. It wasn't part of mainstream biostatistics. And I think this has changed now over the last couple of years. And I think it's really great that the RSS has been organizing this meeting to really put statistics and data here into the focus. I want to thank all the discussants and want to comment a little bit on a few things they said. So Alex was mentioning interpretability versus predictive power, and I guess he's commenting here on more mechanistic models versus the rather statistical approach we've been doing. And that's right. So we really try to do more statistics in this field and to estimate as much as we can from the data at hand, but still use the theory if possible. And he was actually mentioning whether we can incorporate vaccination. I have a feedback in my, I'm not sure if there is somewhere, can you please switch off your, there's some feedback. It's better now. And I just want to mention, yes, we did some work some years ago also to incorporate vaccination rates into this endemic epidemic framework. And actually, epidemic theory suggests a particular form how the vaccination rates should enter as a covariate. So there is this link, right? So we try to get inspired by the theory, and also the endemic epidemic framework, as Maria said, can be actually motivated by discrete time SIR models. So there is this link, but of course, it's what we do is quite different from standard SIR modeling. So there was a comment by Gianpaolo about the contact matrices and how much we should aggregate them or disaggregate them. And that's a very valid point. I'm grateful you raised that, because also we had to make some decisions how we actually aggregate age into these age groups. I just want to mention that this very same issue also occurs in time, and it also occurs in space if you look at the spatial temporal pattern of infectious diseases. So in time, you may model daily cases as we did, but maybe you can also aggregate to weekly cases. And also in space, you may pick the resolution you like. And in particular in spatial statistics, this issue of aggregation consistency is a big thing. And there's a lot of literature on this. And I guess more has to be done also for these models based on contact matrices, as Gianpaolo said, right? He also brought up Einstein, who said apparently models should be as simple as possible, that reminded me of a quote, I think from Dennis Lindley, who said a model should be as big as an elephant. And I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but I think what should be simple is basically the outcome that is delivered to the policymakers. And whether this is some form of effective reproductive number, or maybe more a form of incidence, like what we did in our work, that's up to debate, right? So we focused on what's the increase in cases if you keep the schools open rather than closed, right? So that must be simple, because that's something you have to communicate. But I think what's going on in the background, that doesn't necessarily have to be simple. Yes, and the third thing I want briefly discuss was this suggestion by Steve that we need better null hypothesis. I really appreciate that comment, because we also had trouble how to actually judge the increase that we obtain with these counterfactual analysis, and what is a large increase and what is a small increase, and we didn't find a natural threshold like in a standard statistical null hypothesis. And so those suggestions he made are much appreciated, really. So thanks to all the discussions, and thanks again to the organizers of this great meeting.
Well, I think Peter and I would really like to add our thanks to all of you. Danny, did you wanted to come back? Or? No, we wanted to add our thanks to
Sylvia. I just want to make a very, very quick statement. We talked about communication. I would rather talk about education. We need to educate these people, not just communicate.
Point taken and strongly endorsed. So, coming back to, I think I want to thank all the presenters, the reviewers, and the discussants, and all the participants, because we've had a very continuous audience for, high audience for the 3 sessions, and it just shows how much interest there is in this topic, and I think the convergence of idea and discussion have been very, very thoughtful, and hopefully it will lead to some further discussion or collaborations or kind of position papers in the field, because what I think Peter and I wanted to do was really to try to indeed get these positioned papers and get this debate going, and not just have separate pieces of very high quality technical work presented, but really get this debate. And I think I'm very pleased to say that I think we've succeeded. And I look forward to receive all the contributions. So I remind you that written contribution by the 21st of May, and then it will be back to the presenters to write their reply, and then we could really have a comprehensive current view of the field, and of all the open questions, including the need to think about data collections on some crucial quantities where possibly data collection hasn't been set up or is difficult to set up, but designing good data collection on some of the critical parameters, we could provide direct evidence rather than having them completely latent. I think would be something to think about. I might write about that in my contribution. So this Friday afternoon, I think it's a nice weather, at least in London. I don't know, and I think we've all learned a lot. And I hope that this rapid turn of this turnover of this format of discussion has been productive. This couldn't be done completely in the beginning, because there was so much firefighting by all the group who were day and night and weekends working on that. So it needed a little bit of a time lapse. We couldn't have organized that last spring, for example, and possibly we could have done it in the autumn. But I think it's a good time now, because I think we need to think about preparedness for the future. And besides, keeping track of what's going on now. And I think such discussion will be very useful in terms of preparedness for the future and lesson learned. So with that, I don't know, Lorenzo, you wanted to I see your hand is up.
I would have just replied to a few more comments, but if we're closing here because of time, then that's fine. I'll reply in the chats.
Yes, I think we're closing here because we've overrun a little bit. Thank you. But yes, I think obviously people can communicate directly. So we'll be closing now. Thank you all for attending.